Whoa, hey, welcome to the Bible for Not Dummies. Because if you're interested in what the Bible's all about, then you, my friend, are not a dummy. You may just be curious about the Bible, but if you're curious, it might be God tugging at your heart, because the Bible tells us that God wants everyone to know truth and to know Him. So I'm glad you've joined me for this series of videos where we're answering the question, so what's the Bible all about anyway? In the last episode of the Bible for Not Dummies, we looked at the Old Testament and how it came together through the oral traditions of the people who lived it, the meticulous efforts of many scribes over great periods of time, and the Jewish leaders who pored over the texts listening for God's voice and selecting the texts where they heard Him speak. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, in many ways its formation was not that different from the Old Testament, other than the fact that the books were written later. The process of determining which books to include in the New Testament was not something that happened suddenly, and it wasn't arbitrary either. In fact, one of the most important factors that determined if a book would be included in the New Testament or not was whether or not the book was regularly used and universally recognized by the greater church, just like with the Old Testament. And by the 4th century AD, that's 300 to 400 AD, the Christian church had spread as far as present-day Spain in the west to Asia Minor in the east. Much of this spread was due to the fact that the early church missionaries like Paul, who I briefly mentioned in the first episode, started churches in key cities along the major east-west trade routes. This allowed people from many places and cultures to learn about Jesus and Christianity as they were passing through these cities. Paul wrote many letters to the churches he started and to the people that he mentored during his missionary journeys. And these letters would get copied and taken from one city to the next to be read during church meetings. Also, for reasons that aren't fully known, the Roman Emperor Tiberius expelled the Jews from Rome in 19 AD, many of these being Christian Jews, who then settled in the surrounding regions. At some point later, Jews were allowed to return to Rome, but then in 49 AD, Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews again, and once more many of these Christian Jews had to once again settle the surrounding regions. For the most part, Christian devotion to a single God, as well as the rise of converts to Christianity, didn't sit well with the culture of Rome. This is where people believed in many gods, and the emperors were viewed as gods themselves. So, as the Jewish Christians spread throughout the known world, they carried with them copies of Paul's writings as well as other manuscripts written by Jesus' disciples. Many of these writings had become so familiar to the entire church at the time that they were accepted as part of the New Testament canon and are considered as inspired by the Spirit of God. Now, this isn't to say that there wasn't criteria for determining whether a book should be included in the New Testament or not, because as time went on, writings began to appear which had not been used or accepted by the church as a whole. These texts usually popped up in local areas and often much later than the already accepted texts. In these cases, the early church would examine the texts and look for certain qualities to determine whether the text should become part of the New Testament canon. For example, authorship was very important. Many of the already accepted texts were written by some of Jesus' 12 disciples, so there was little question of who wrote them. Now, not all of the books of the New Testament were written by Jesus' disciples, but those that weren't were written by someone who directly knew and learned from one of the disciples. The clearest example of this is the Gospel of Luke, and another example is the book of Acts. These were both written by Luke, but Luke wasn't one of Jesus' 12 disciples. However, Luke traveled with Paul and learned from him. And while Paul lived at the same time as the events recorded in the New Testament and was witness to some of them himself, he was not one of Jesus' 12 disciples. But when he became a believer, the church leaders saw his sincerity, they believed in his conversion, and accepted him as a fellow teacher of the faith, otherwise known as an apostle.
Wait a minute, what exactly is an apostle?
Very good question. Before Jesus was crucified, his followers were called disciples. In other words, students or followers. After Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, his closest disciples became teachers of the good news. Instead of being followers, Jesus now sent them out. Go and make disciples of all nations. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 19. The Greek word for a person who is sent is apostolos, or apostle in English. So the title applied to the disciples after Jesus sent them out, and it applied to Paul as well. So the New Testament texts were either written by an apostle or someone who directly learned from an apostle. This means that all the books of the New Testament were written before the end of the first century, or approximately within 25 to 60 years of Jesus' crucifixion. All the accepted books of the New Testament were certainly written within the lifetime of first-hand eyewitnesses. This played a significant part in determining which books to include in the New Testament. Now, while the author of the book of Hebrews is unknown, descriptions of events and practices within the book help to date it to the same period as the other New Testament books. And this actually brings us to another important quality that was considered by the early church in determining whether or not a book should be included in the New Testament. Was the content of the book faithful and consistent with what was written in other accepted New and Old Testament books? In the case of the book of Hebrews, this was absolutely true. Hebrews actually, in a very eloquent and profound way, brings the Old Testament into greater clarity in the light of the New Testament and good news of Jesus Christ. Now, in recent days, there have been many so-called lost gospels or other New Testament books that have been discovered.
So why aren't these books included in the New Testament canon?
That's a good question. These books were never really lost by the early church. To put it simply, they were rejected by the early church. They were rejected because they were not written by credible authors. And when compared to the accepted books of the New Testament, the teachings were contradictory. Also, they were all too often not in line with the life and person of Jesus Christ, as personally testified to by the apostles. Many of them were also written 100 to 300 years after Jesus' crucifixion, some of them even later. So the writers weren't directly linked to Jesus or the apostles. So once again, the books that pop up in the media from time to time claiming to be lost books of the New Testament were not missed by the early church, nor were they accidentally left out. The books were simply rejected.
Survey said.
Parchment and ink was the internet of the ancient world, and just like we don't believe everything we read on the internet today, the early church was no less savvy when it came to discerning the authenticity of what they read in a manuscript in their day. So by the 2nd century AD, or 100 to 200 AD, 20 of the 27 books of the New Testament were accepted as authoritative and inspired by the Spirit of God. And by the end of the 5th century, or 400 to 500 AD, all 27 books of the New Testament, as we have them today, were accepted as authoritative, inspired by the Spirit of God. While a number of councils, such as the Council of Rome in 332 AD and the Third Council of Carthage in 397 AD, documented the list of 27 accepted books of the New Testament, there wasn't any kind of vote or final verdict by the council. They simply recognized and affirmed what had already been accepted by the greater church at the time. Similarly, the Bishop of Alexandria, named Athanasius, had a tradition of writing a letter to his churches every Easter, and in 367 AD, his Easter letter contained a list of the 27 recognized books of the New Testament, the same 27 books we have in our New Testament today. Now, I do want to point out that we don't actually have original copies of the manuscripts written by the apostles. With the technology of the time, there was no way original manuscripts could have been preserved until today. So it's natural to ask,
So how do we know that the New Testament books that we have today are accurate and represent what the apostles really wrote?
and that's a great question to ask, and it should be asked. So, two of the oldest existing fragments of copies of the New Testament manuscripts can be found in the Sackler Library at the University of Oxford in England. These manuscript fragments come from copies of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Matthew. A third manuscript fragment housed at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology comes from a copy of the Book of Revelation. And a fourth manuscript fragment housed at the John Rylands University Library in Manchester, UK, contains a portion of a copy of the Gospel of John written in Greek. And what's amazing about these fragments is that all four of them date to the 2nd century AD, or 100 to 200 AD. 11 other manuscript fragments from copies of New Testament books have been found to date back to somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The Codex Sinaiticus in the London British Library is a complete Greek New Testament that dates back to the 4th century AD, or 400 to 500 AD. If we look at all the existing ancient manuscripts that have currently been discovered, there are approximately 5,800 in Greek and over 19,000 in other languages. The average length of the Greek ancient New Testament manuscripts is about 450 pages. This equates to about 2.6 million pages of biblical texts, and that's not counting the 19,000 manuscripts in other languages. Just to put this in context, the earliest copies of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars dates back to 900 years after Julius Caesar's time, and only 12 ancient manuscript copies are currently known to exist. The Iliad by Homer, which is considered one of the most preserved ancient texts, was written about 400 years after the events he wrote about, and there are currently about 1,500 ancient manuscripts of his work. And as with the New Testament manuscripts, these are not originals but ancient copies, since this was the method of preservation in the ancient world. So I say this only to address the question of whether or not the New Testament texts are reliable. When we have that many copies of the ancient text, tens of thousands as in the case of the New Testament, as well as copies that date back to within 100 to 300 years of the originals, comparisons between these copies provides great assurance that what we have today has been accurately preserved. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Don't take my word for it. I recommend that you investigate it for yourself. For more information on the reliability of the New Testament documents, you can check out these websites, answersingenesis.org and BibleArchaeologyReport.com, or you can check out one of these books by Lee Strobel or F.F. Bruce. And so there you have it, a brief overview of how the New Testament was formed, as well as the reliability of the texts within it. I hope you'll join me for the next episode, where we're finally going to dive into the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the creation. So until next time, thanks for joining me on The Bible for Not Dummies.